The boss was frozen when he saw his lost daughter's pendant around the gardener's neck. The afternoon sun draped itself across the Calder estate like liquid gold, turning the rose gardens into something out of a painting. Thomas Calder stood at his office window, pen hovering over a contract worth $8 million, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. It usually was, 50 years old, and he still couldn't focus on the present. His therapist, the fourth one in 10 years, kept telling him that acceptance was part of healing. But how do you accept that your 5-year-old daughter vanished in broad daylight? How do you forgive yourself for being 20 minutes late? He sighed, pressing his fingers against his temples. The headaches had been worse lately. Probably stress, probably guilt that never quite went away, no matter how many zeros he added to his bank account. That's when something caught his eye. Thomas lifted his head. Down in the garden, between the blue hydrangeas his late ex-wife had loved so much, a young woman knelt by the bushes with pruning shears. She couldn't have been more than mid-20s, wearing a faded green uniform that had seen better days. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face had that sun-kissed look of someone who spent their life outdoors. But it wasn't any of that which made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. It was the necklace, small, golden, catching the afternoon light like it was winking at him, heart-shaped with a star etched in the center. It swayed gently as she worked, and Thomas felt his knees go weak. He knew that necklace. He'd know it anywhere. He'd had it custom-made at a jeweler in Pasadena 19 years ago, paid extra for the engraving on the back, placed it around his daughter's neck on her 5th birthday, while she squealed with delight, "Daddy, it's shining like a real star." 3 days later, Valentina was gone. Thomas didn't remember deciding to move. One moment he was at his desk. The next he was halfway down the marble staircase, his heart hammering against his ribs. The butler said something to him, probably asking if he needed anything, but Thomas didn't hear it. Couldn't hear anything over the roar of blood in his ears. He pushed through the French doors that led to the gardens, his expensive Italian shoes crunching on the gravel path. The young woman still hadn't noticed him. She was completely absorbed in her work, humming something under her breath. "Miss!" His voice came out rough, broken. She jumped, spinning around with dirt-stained hands pressed against her chest. "Oh, Mr. Calder, I'm so sorry. I didn't hear you coming. Is everything okay? Do you need something?" American accent. West Coast? Probably California born and raised. Her eyes were light brown, warm despite the obvious nervousness at being approached by her employer. Thomas couldn't take his eyes off the necklace. That necklace! Where did you get it? Her hand flew to her throat, fingers wrapping protectively around the golden heart. It was... She hesitated, something vulnerable flickering across her face. "It was the only thing I had with me. They said I was wearing it when they found me." The world tilted. When they found you? Yeah. She looked uncomfortable now, like she'd revealed too much. "I grew up in an orphanage up in Fresno. Someone left me there when I was about 5, I think. I don't remember anything before that, just this necklace." Thomas couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except stare at this young woman who looked so beautifully, impossibly ordinary. Could I see it, please?" She bit her lip, clearly uncertain about handing over what was probably her most precious possession to a man who was practically a stranger. But something in his face must have convinced her, because she slowly reached back and unclasped it. The metal was warm from her skin when she placed it in his trembling hand. Thomas turned it over with shaking fingers, searching for the engraving he knew had to be there. The gold had worn thin in spots, 19 years of constant wear taking its toll, but the words were still legible. "To Valentina, my eternal star, Dad." The sound that came out of Thomas's throat wasn't quite a sob, wasn't quite a gasp. His legs gave out. One of the wealthiest men in California dropped to his knees in the middle of his own garden, clutching a necklace to his chest like it was the only thing keeping him alive. Maybe it was. Sir, what's wrong? Are you okay?" The young woman, Grace, her name tag said Grace, knelt beside him, one dirt-stained hand hovering uncertainly near his shoulder. "Should I call someone? Do you need a doctor?" Thomas looked up at her through tears. He hadn't even realized he was crying, really looked at her for the first time. And there, beneath the simple clothes and the working tan and the 19 years of life he knew nothing about, he saw it. Those light brown eyes, the shape of her chin, the dimple in her left cheek that only showed when she was worried, just like it had when she was 5 years old and thought she'd done something wrong. "You," his voice cracked. "You're my daughter." Grace stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Hell, maybe he had. Maybe this was what finally broke him, seeing a necklace on a stranger and constructing an entire impossible fantasy around it. But the engraving was real. The necklace was real. And somewhere, buried under 19 years of survival and forgotten memories, his daughter was real too. I don't understand," Grace whispered, her eyes wide. "What are you talking about?" Thomas held up the necklace, his hand still shaking. I had this made. For my daughter, for Valentina. She disappeared 19 years ago from a park in Pasadena. She was 5 years old. She was wearing this." Grace's face had gone pale. That's not possible. I'm nobody. Just a girl who grew up in foster care. You can't just... Please." Thomas didn't care that he was begging, didn't care that tears were streaming down his face or that his $5,000 suit was getting covered in dirt and grass stains. "Please, just sit with me. Let me explain. Let me tell you what happened." For a long moment, Grace just stared at him. Thomas could see the thoughts racing behind her eyes, probably trying to figure out if her boss had completely lost it, if she should run, if she should call for help. But then, slowly, she nodded. Okay, yeah, let's go sit down somewhere." They ended up in the gazebo at the far end of the garden, sitting across from each other like strangers, which is exactly what they were, except Thomas knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that they weren't strangers at all. As the golden afternoon stretched toward evening, Thomas Calder began to tell Grace the story of the worst day of his life, and with every word, he watched something shift in her eyes, confusion giving way to uncertainty giving way to something that looked almost like hope. The necklace lay on the table between them, catching the last rays of sunlight, shining like the star his daughter had always believed it to be. The gazebo felt both too large and too small for the weight of what Thomas was about to say. Grace sat across from him, hands folded in her lap, the necklace still lying between them like a bridge across 19 years of darkness. Thomas didn't know where to start. How do you compress nearly 2 decades of grief into words that make sense? "Her name was Valentina," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "My daughter. She had your eyes. That exact shade of brown that looks gold when the sun hits it just right. She loved strawberries and hated bedtime. She'd make me read the same story 3 times before she'd even consider sleeping." Grace didn't say anything, but her fingers tightened around each other. "I was married to her mother, Margaret. We were having problems." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that had become habit whenever he talked about those days. "Nothing terrible, just the usual stuff. I worked too much. She felt alone. We started fighting more than we talked. Her sister Eleanor, Margaret's sister, she didn't help matters. Always in Margaret's ear about how I was this arrogant businessman who didn't appreciate what he had. Was she right?" Grace asked quietly. The question hit harder than Thomas expected. Yeah, she probably was. I was building an empire and missing my daughter's childhood. Classic story, right? You don't know what you have until it's gone." He picked up the necklace, turning it over in his hands like a prayer. "We separated when Valentina was 4. Nothing official. Just, Margaret moved out, took Valentina with her. I got her on weekends. It was messy and it hurt, but we were trying to figure it out, for Valentina's sake. The memory of that spring day 19 years ago was so vivid it might as well have been yesterday. Thomas could still smell the jasmine blooming outside his office, could still hear his assistant reminding him he needed to leave early to pick up his daughter. "It was a Saturday in April," he continued. "Margaret was taking Valentina to the park near our old house in Pasadena, the one with the big playground and the duck pond. I was supposed to pick her up at 5, had it marked on my calendar. Set 3 alarms on my phone. I wasn't going to be late. Not this time." Grace leaned forward slightly, drawn into the story despite herself. "But there was a meeting. Last-minute thing with investors from Japan. I told myself it would be quick. 30 minutes, tops. I'd still make it on time." Thomas's voice cracked. "It wasn't quick. The meeting ran long. Traffic was hell. I didn't get to the park until almost 6. He could still see it. The police cars, the flashing lights. Margaret's face white as death as she screamed at the officers that they needed to do more. Find more. Search harder. Valentina was gone, just gone. Margaret said she'd been on the swings 1 minute, and then she turned around to grab something from her bag. And when she looked back, Thomas had to stop, swallow hard against the lump in his throat. She was 5 years old. She couldn't have just wandered off. Someone took her. Grace's hand had moved to her throat, pressing against the spot where the necklace usually hung. The police searched everywhere, put out Amber Alerts, had volunteers combing the area for weeks. But there was nothing, no witnesses, no demands, no body. He hated that last word, hated that he'd had to think it so many times over the years. She just vanished. And her mother. Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. Margaret never recovered. She blamed herself. I blamed myself. We blamed each other. Thomas set the necklace back down, unable to look at it anymore. She fell into this deep depression. Wouldn't eat. Wouldn't sleep. Spent all her time making flyers. Calling tip lines. Driving around to places Valentina had never even been. Eleanor tried to help, but Margaret had just disappeared inside herself. 2 years after Valentina vanished, Margaret died. The doctor said it was heart failure, but we both know what it really was. Grace's eyes were shining with unshed tears. She died of a broken heart. Yeah, Thomas nodded. And I kept going because, hell, I don't know why. Guilt, maybe, built the business bigger. Made more money than I could ever spend. Hired private investigators who found nothing. Chased leads that went nowhere. For 19 years, I've looked for her in every crowd, every park, every little girl with brown hair. I never stopped looking, never stopped hoping. And now, he finally met Grace's eyes. Now you're sitting here, wearing the one thing that could prove who you are. The necklace I had custom made, the one that was on my daughter when she disappeared. Grace touched her throat again, like she could still feel the weight of it. I don't remember anything. They told me at the orphanage that someone dropped me off saying I was a relative's kid, that there'd been some family trouble, left some cash for my care and disappeared. The necklace was all I had. Do you remember anything at all? Even flashes, dreams. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the necklace. Sometimes I dream about a man in a suit. He picks me up and spins me around and I'm laughing. Really laughing, you know. The kind of laugh you can't fake, and there's sunshine and I feel safe. Thomas felt like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed. He used to do that. Spin Valentina around until they were both dizzy. Her laughter the best sound he'd ever heard. We need to do a DNA test, he said, the words tumbling out. I know this sounds crazy. I know you probably think I've lost my mind. But please, let me do this. Let me know for sure. Grace studied him for a long moment. Thomas could see the war playing out behind her eyes. The orphan girl who'd learned not to hope too hard, battling against the part of her that desperately wanted this impossible story to be true. Okay, she finally said. Okay, we can do the test, but Mr. Calder... Thomas, please. Thomas, she corrected softly. You need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this is just a coincidence, that I'm not her. I don't want you to get hurt. He almost laughed. Almost. Grace, I've been hurt for 19 years. If there's even a chance, even the smallest possibility, that I've found my daughter, then I have to know. I have to. She nodded slowly. How long will it take? The test. A few days, maybe a week. I'll have my doctor expedite everything. Thomas leaned forward, desperate now. Stay here, at the house, as a guest, not an employee. Let me get to know you while we wait, please. I don't think that's appropriate. I work for you. You might be my daughter. The words hung in the air between them. And even if you're not, even if this is all some impossible coincidence, I need this. I need to believe, just for a little while, that maybe, the universe isn't completely cruel. Grace looked down at her dirt-stained uniform, then back at the mansion visible through the garden. I wouldn't even know how to act in a place like this. Just be yourself. That's all I'm asking. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, in that golden light. Thomas could almost see her, the little girl who'd called him Daddy, who'd believed a metal heart could shine like a real star. "Okay," Grace said finally. "I'll stay, until we get the results." Thomas closed his eyes, overwhelmed with gratitude and terror in equal measure, because now there was hope, and hope, he'd learned, could hurt worse than grief, but it could also save you. Grace moved into one of the guest rooms that evening, though calling it a room felt like an understatement. It was larger than any apartment she'd ever lived in, with a 4-poster bed, its own sitting area, and a bathroom with marble everything. She stood in the doorway for a full minute, afraid to step inside with her work boots still covered in garden dirt. "The closet has some clothes that should fit," Thomas had told her, his voice still thick with emotion. "They belonged to, well, they're new. I had my assistant pick up some things, just in case you said yes. Just in case." Like he'd been hoping for this moment even before it happened, Grace showered for the first time in a bathroom that felt like a spa, watching 19 years of hard living swirl down a drain that probably cost more than her car. When she emerged wrapped in a towel that was somehow both impossibly soft and impossibly white, she found the closet Thomas had mentioned. He wasn't kidding. There were jeans in her size, comfortable sweaters, even pajamas with the tags still attached. Grace ran her fingers over the fabrics, fighting the urge to check the price tags. She'd learned early in life that knowing what things cost only made you feel worse about not having them. She dressed in simple jeans and a blue sweater, then sat on the edge of the bed, which felt like sitting on a cloud, and tried to process what had just happened to her life. This morning, she'd been Grace Murphy, 24-year-old nobody with a high school diploma and dirt under her fingernails. Now she was potentially Valentina Calder, missing heiress to a fortune she couldn't even comprehend. It was too much. All of it. The knock on her door made her jump. "Come in." Thomas entered, and she noticed he'd changed too. Traded his ruined suit for casual slacks and a button-down with the sleeves rolled up. He looked younger somehow, less like a CEO and more like just a dad. "I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed," he said, hovering uncertainly in the doorway like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to enter. "It's perfect, really. This is all." Grace gestured around the room. "It's a lot. Too much. I don't know yet." She offered a small smile. "Ask me when my head stops spinning." Thomas smiled back, but it faded quickly. "Grace, I need you to know that whatever happens with the test, whatever we find out, you have a job here as long as you want one. And not just as a gardener. I mean, if you want to keep working with the plants, that's great, but Thomas," she cut him off gently, "one thing at a time, okay? Let's just see what the test says." He nodded, looking relieved that she'd stopped him from making promises he might not be able to keep. "Right, one thing at a time. Dinner's at 7 if you're hungry. Nothing fancy, I promise." After he left, Grace lay back on the cloud bed and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in this massive house was a man who believed she was his daughter, a man who'd spent 19 years looking for a little girl in every face he passed. What if she wasn't that girl? What if the necklace was just a coincidence? Some cosmic joke? What if she was? The next morning, Thomas's personal physician arrived to draw blood for the DNA test. Dr. Chen was professional and kind, asking questions about her medical history that Grace mostly couldn't answer. "I was pretty healthy as a kid, I guess. No major illnesses that I know of. That I know of," was a phrase Grace used a lot. It was the orphan's disclaimer, the acknowledgement that her life had a 5-year blank spot where memories should be. "Results in 3 to 5 days. Doctor," Chen promised as she packed up her kit. "I'll call Mr. Calder the moment they're in." 3 to 5 days. Grace could survive 3 to 5 days of this strange limbo. She spent the morning walking the estate, reacquainting herself with gardens she'd only known as work sites. Everything looked different from this side of things, less like tasks to be completed, and more like art to be appreciated. The rose garden alone probably cost more to maintain than she'd earned in the past 2 years. She was examining a bed of white tulips when she heard the voice. "So you're the girl who's convinced Thomas she's his long-lost daughter." Grace turned to find a woman watching her from the stone pathway. 60-ish, elegant in that way that comes from a lifetime of money, wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than Grace's car. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, and her smile was the coldest thing Grace had ever seen. "I'm Grace," she said, straightening up, "and I haven't convinced anyone of anything. We're waiting on a DNA test." "How convenient." The woman moved closer, her heels clicking on the stone. "A necklace that anyone could have stolen or copied, and a sad story about being abandoned at an orphanage. Tell me, Grace, how long have you been planning this little con?" Grace felt her face flush. I didn't plan anything. I was hired to work in the garden. I didn't even know who Thomas was until you saw an opportunity." The woman's smile sharpened. "I've seen this before, you know. When someone has money like Thomas does, the vultures circle. Usually they're a little more sophisticated about it. I'll give you that. The orphan angle is a nice touch. Who are you?" "Eleanor Price. I'm Thomas's sister-in-law. Or I was, before my sister died of grief over losing her daughter." Eleanor's eyes raked over Grace, assessing and dismissing. "I know what real loss looks like, dear, and I know what opportunism looks like too." Grace wanted to argue, to defend herself, but what could she say? She didn't remember being Valentina Calder. She couldn't prove anything until the test came back, and Eleanor was right. From the outside, this whole thing looked suspicious as hell. "I understand why you'd think that," Grace said carefully, "but I'm not trying to con anyone. If the DNA test says I'm not his daughter, I'll leave. No drama, no demands. You have my word. The word of a stranger means very little." "I'm afraid," Eleanor adjusted her purse on her shoulder, "but I suppose we'll see what the test reveals. Though I have to warn you, DNA tests can be faked. Necklaces can be stolen if you think you're going to waltz in here and claim a fortune that doesn't belong to you. You're going to be very disappointed." She walked away before Grace could respond, leaving her standing alone among the tulips, feeling like she'd just been slapped. Grace found Thomas in his office an hour later, staring at a photograph on his desk. When he saw her in the doorway, he quickly wiped at his eyes. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," she said. "No, please, come in." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "I was just looking at old photos. Probably not the healthiest thing to do, but..." Grace could see the picture from where she sat. A little girl with brown hair and a gap-toothed smile, holding up a drawing of what might have been a house, or possibly a very square dog. "She was beautiful," Grace said softly. "She was perfect." Thomas set the photo down carefully. "You look like her, you know. It's not just the necklace. There's something in your face. The way you tilt your head when you're thinking. The dimple in your left cheek. Margaret used to say Valentina got that from my side of the family." Grace touched her cheek unconsciously. "I met Eleanor this morning." Thomas's expression darkened. "What did she say?" "That I'm a con artist. That I'm after your money." Grace met his eyes. "Is that what you think?" "No." His answer was immediate and firm. "No, I don't think that at all. Eleanor is complicated. She's been through a lot. Lost her sister. Watched this family fall apart. She's protective, but sometimes that comes out as paranoia. She said DNA tests can be faked." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Grace, I've been doing business for 30 years. I know when someone is trying to manipulate me, and you're not. You didn't come to me with this necklace. I came to you. You didn't ask for anything. Hell, you were reluctant to even stay here. But what if..." "No what ifs," Thomas interrupted gently. "Not until we have the results. Eleanor will believe what she wants to believe. Right now, I'm choosing to have hope. Is that okay with you?" Grace felt something loosen in her chest. Yeah, that's okay with me." That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She wandered the halls of the mansion, running her fingers along walls that probably had more history than she did. She ended up in the main living room, where a large painting hung above the fireplace. It showed a woman and a small child in a field of sunflowers. The woman was beautiful, but sad, holding the child like she was afraid to let go. The little girl was laughing, reaching toward a butterfly. Grace stared at the painting for a long time, feeling something stir in the back of her mind, something old and buried and trying desperately to surface. She'd seen this painting before. She didn't know how or when or why, but she knew she had. Thomas insisted Grace join him for dinner the next evening, not in the formal dining room. Too stuffy, he'd said, but in a smaller space off the kitchen that still managed to be nicer than any restaurant Grace had ever been to. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, no relation to the doctor, had prepared roasted chicken with herbs. Grace couldn't identify in vegetables that actually tasted like something. Grace ate slowly, hyper-aware of every movement, terrified she'd use the wrong fork or commit some social crime that would prove she didn't belong here. "You can relax, you know," Thomas said, watching her with amusement. "It's just dinner. Just dinner in a house worth more than a small country," Grace muttered, then froze. "Sorry, that was honest." Thomas smiled. "I like honest. I'm surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear. It's refreshing." They ate in comfortable silence for a moment before Grace found herself asking, "What was she like, Valentina? I mean, really like, not just the highlights." Thomas set down his fork, his expression softening in that way it did whenever he talked about his daughter. "She was stubborn as hell. Got that from both of us. Unfortunately, once she decided she wanted something, there was no talking her out of it." He laughed quietly. "When she was 4, she decided she wanted to be a dinosaur for Halloween. Not dress up as one. Actually be one. Threw a fit when we tried to explain that wasn't possible. What did you do? Bought her a T-Rex costume and told her she was the most realistic dinosaur I'd ever seen." Thomas's eyes were distant, lost in memory. "She wore it for 3 weeks straight. To the grocery store, to the park, even tried to wear it to bed. Margaret finally had to hide it just to get her to wear normal clothes." Grace found herself smiling. "That sounds exhausting." "It was." Thomas picked up his wine glass. "It was also the best time of my life. I was too stupid to realize it then. You couldn't have known." "I should have." His voice went hard. "I should have been there on time. Should have picked up my daughter when I said I would. Should have." He stopped himself, jaw tight. "Sorry, old guilt dies hard." Grace understood that. She'd spent years carrying her own version. The guilt of being abandoned, of somehow not being worth keeping. It was irrational, she knew. But knowing something and feeling it were different things. They moved to the living room after dinner, and Grace found herself drawn again to the painting of the sunflowers. In the lamplight, the colors seemed to shimmer, the woman's sad smile even more pronounced. "That's Margaret," Thomas said, coming to stand beside her. "And Valentina. An artist friend painted it about 3 months before." He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Grace stepped closer to the painting, her heart starting to beat faster. "When did you hang this back up?" "About 6 months ago. It was in storage for years. Too painful to look at. But my therapist said hiding from the past wasn't helping. So," Thomas shrugged. "Now it's here." "The sunflowers," Grace heard herself say. "They were so tall, taller than me. And the smell. They smelled like sunshine feels, if that makes sense." Thomas went very still beside her. "What?" Grace's hand rose to her temple, pressing against a sudden headache. There was a butterfly, a monarch, I think, orange and black. It landed on one of the flowers, and Mama. She stopped, the word freezing in her throat. I mean, the woman. She was crying. Why was she crying when everything was so beautiful? "Grace." Thomas's voice was strained. "How do you know that?" "I don't know. I just..." Grace stared at the painting, and suddenly it wasn't just paint anymore. It was a memory, fuzzy and incomplete, but real. The paint was still wet. I remember because I touched it and got yellow on my fingers, and someone, you said it was okay, that paintings were meant to be touched. But that wasn't true because the artist got upset. Thomas grabbed her shoulders gently, turning her to face him. His eyes were wide, almost wild. The artist did get upset. He said Valentina had ruined the piece, that he'd have to start over, I told him. If he couldn't handle a child being curious, he was a shitty artist. We fought about it. But he didn't start over. Grace continued, the words coming faster now. He left the fingerprint, said it made it more real, more honest. Thomas's hands trembled on her shoulders. Grace, how do you know that? That painting was locked away. I only brought it out recently. You couldn't have... I was there. Grace felt tears streaming down her face without knowing when they'd started. Oh God, I was there. I remember the field. It was summer, and the sunflowers were everywhere, and Mama was sad because Because the headache intensified, and with it came more fragments. A park, swings creaking, the smell of popcorn, a woman's voice calling her name. Valentina, sweetie, don't go too far. But she had gone far. Not far, really. Just to see the ducks. She loved the ducks with their funny waddles and quacking. Someone had been there. Someone who'd smiled at her and said her daddy sent them to get her. That it was a surprise. She'd believe them. Why wouldn't she? She was 5 years old. Grace's knees buckled, and Thomas caught her, lowering them both to the floor. It's okay. You're okay. Just breathe. I remember, Grace gasped. Not everything, but pieces. The park. The ducks. Someone came and said you sent them. That it was a surprise. I went with them because I thought, who? Thomas's voice was urgent. Who came, Grace? Did you see their face? Grace squeezed her eyes shut, trying to pull the memory into focus. But it was like trying to hold water in her hands. I don't know. It's blurry. Everything after that is just dark. And then the orphanage. Thomas held her while she cried, his own tears falling into her hair. It's okay. It's okay. You're safe now. You're home. But was she? Grace didn't know this house. Didn't know this life. She was a stranger wearing someone else's memories like an ill-fitting coat. The ducks, she said suddenly, pulling back to look at Thomas. You used to take me to feed the ducks. At a different park before, one closer to home. You'd buy the duck food even though the sign said not to feed them, and you'd let me throw it. And I'd always throw too hard and scare them away. Thomas laughed through his tears. Every single time. You had zero concept of gentle. And the bedtime stories, you'd read them in different voices. Grace's own voice was wondering, like she was discovering herself for the first time. The big bad wolf sounded like a movie gangster. The 3 little pigs had British accents. It was ridiculous. You loved it. I did. Grace touched her face, feeling the tears there like proof she was real. Thomas, I remember. Not everything, but enough. I remember you. They sat there on the floor of the living room, surrounded by wealth that meant nothing compared to what they'd found. Not proof. The DNA test would provide that. But something more important. Recognition. I have more photos, Thomas said eventually. Albums full, would you? Would you want to look through them with me? Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. They spent the next 2 hours on the couch. Going through album after album, Thomas narrated each photo. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, Grace would feel that spark of recognition. A birthday party where she'd insisted on wearing her swimsuit despite it being February. A trip to the beach where she'd been more interested in the sand than the water. Her first day of preschool, clutching Thomas's hand like a lifeline. I was terrified, Grace said, looking at that last photo, of being left alone with strangers. Thomas closed his eyes. You cried for an hour. The teacher finally called me to come back. Margaret was furious that I'd given in, but I couldn't. Couldn't leave me upset. Grace finished. You stayed the whole first week, sitting in the back of the classroom. You remember that. I'm starting to. As the night wore on, more pieces fell into place. Not a complete picture. There were still huge gaps. Years lost to whatever trauma had locked her memories away. But enough. Enough to know that Grace Murphy and Valentina Calder were the same person. The DNA test would confirm it. But in her heart, Grace already knew. She was home. The call came on a Thursday morning, 4 days after Dr. Chen had drawn their blood. Grace was in the garden. Her garden again, though it felt different now, when she saw Thomas running toward her from the house. Actually running. His phone still pressed to his ear. His face lit up in a way that made her heart stop. She knew before he said anything. It's positive, Thomas said, breathless. Grace, Valentina, it's positive. You're my daughter. The DNA is a match. You're really her. You're really... He couldn't finish. Just pulled her into his arms and held on like he'd never let go again. Grace felt her own tears start, hot and fast, soaking into his shirt. I'm home, she whispered. Dad, I'm really home. Dad. The word felt strange and perfect all at once, like a shoe she'd forgotten she owned finally fitting again. Thomas pulled back. cupping her face in his hands. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I wasn't there, that I let this happen, that you spent 19 years. Stop." Grace covered his hands with hers. "You didn't let anything happen. Someone took me. That's not your fault. I was late. 20 minutes. You were 20 minutes late. That's not a crime, Dad. That's just being human." She smiled through her tears. "And you never gave up looking. That's what matters." They stood there in the garden, holding each other while the morning sun painted everything gold. Grace, Valentina, felt something click into place inside her chest. A piece of herself she hadn't known was missing suddenly found and returned. "We need to celebrate," Thomas said finally, wiping his eyes. "Properly. I'll call everyone. We'll have dinner here, make the announcement official, unless you'd rather keep it quiet for now." Grace thought about that. Part of her wanted to hide, to keep this precious thing private and safe. But another part, the part that was tired of being nobody, of having no history, no family, no roots, wanted to shout it from the rooftops. "Let's tell people," she said. "I'm tired of hiding." Thomas beamed. "I'll have Mrs. Chen prepare something special, and we should call my lawyer. Start the paperwork to officially restore your identity. Change your name back if you want, though Grace is beautiful if you'd rather." "Valentina Grace," she interrupted. "If that's okay. I don't want to lose who I became, but I want to remember who I was too." "Valentina Grace Calder." Thomas tested it out. "It's perfect. You're perfect." They walked back to the house together, Thomas's arm around her shoulders like he was afraid she might disappear again if he let go. Grace understood. She felt the same way. The celebration dinner was planned for that evening. Small, Thomas promised. Just a few close friends and business associates, people who'd known Valentina before, who'd helped search for her after, and Eleanor. Of course, Thomas's sister-in-law, who'd made it clear she thought Grace was a fraud. "She needs to hear it from us," Thomas said when Grace suggested maybe Eleanor shouldn't come. "And she needs to see the test results. Once she understands this is real, she'll come around." Grace wasn't so sure, but she nodded anyway. This was Thomas's family, however complicated. She wouldn't ask him to choose. By 6 o'clock, Grace was dressed in a simple black dress from the closet, one of dozens Thomas had bought on Hope alone, and trying not to throw up from nerves. She'd faced down plenty of hard things in her life: hunger, loneliness, uncertainty, but walking into a room full of strangers as Valentina Calder, returned heiress, felt impossible. "You look beautiful," Thomas said from her doorway. He'd changed into a suit, but kept it casual. No tie, jacket unbuttoned. "But if you're not ready for this, we can wait. There's no rush." "No, I want to do this." Grace smoothed the dress. "Just don't leave me alone, okay? I don't know these people." "I won't leave your side for a second." The guests arrived in a trickle. Marcus Chen, Thomas's business partner, who'd apparently known Valentina as a baby, Sarah and David Wu, family friends who'd organized search parties 19 years ago, Dr. Linda Reeves, the therapist Thomas had been seeing since Margaret died. They all stared at Grace with variations of the same expression: wonder, disbelief, and something that looked almost like fear, like seeing her alive broke something in them. They'd carefully built around her absence. "My God," Sarah Wu breathed, tears already streaming. "Thomas, she has Margaret's eyes, and your stubborn chin," Marcus added with a laugh that sounded suspiciously wet. "I can't believe, after all these years." Grace smiled and shook hands, and accepted hugs from people who felt like strangers, but looked at her like she was a miracle. It was overwhelming, and wonderful, and terrifying all at once. Then Eleanor arrived. She swept in wearing a severe gray dress, her expression carved from ice. "Thomas, I came as you requested. Thank you for being here." Thomas kept his arm around Grace's shoulders. "I wanted you to hear this from me. The DNA test came back. Grace is Valentina. My daughter. She's really come home." Eleanor's eyes flickered to Grace, cold and assessing. "May I see the results?" Thomas handed her the folder Dr. Chen had provided. Eleanor read through it carefully, her lips pressed into a thin line. When she finished, she closed the folder with a sharp snap, "These tests can be falsified," she said. The room went silent. Grace felt Thomas tense beside her. "Eleanor," Marcus said carefully, "those results came from Dr. Chen. You know her reputation. I know that people can be bought." Eleanor's gaze never left Grace. "I know that when there's money involved, integrity becomes flexible. And I know that this young woman has everything to gain by convincing Thomas she's his daughter. The necklace," Thomas started, "could have been stolen or forged." Eleanor finally looked at her brother-in-law. "Thomas, I understand you want to believe. God knows I understand that. But you need to think rationally. This girl shows up out of nowhere, wearing a necklace that may or may not be authentic, with a convenient story about amnesia and orphanages. I have memories," Grace said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. Of the sunflower painting, of feeding ducks at the park, of bedtime stories with funny voices, things I couldn't know unless I was there. Eleanor's smile was pitying. Or things you were told about, perhaps by someone who did know the real Valentina. Someone who helped you construct this elaborate lie. That's enough. Thomas's voice went hard. "Eleanor, I know you're trying to protect me, but this isn't protection. This is paranoia. The DNA doesn't lie. Grace, Valentina, is my daughter. And once she's officially recognized as your heir," Eleanor continued, voice rising, "have you thought about what questions might surface? Questions about who really took her that day. Questions that might implicate—" She stopped abruptly, like she'd said too much. Thomas frowned. "Implicate who?" Eleanor recovered quickly. "Anyone connected to the family. The publicity will be intense. Investigators will reopen the case. Every detail of that day will be examined again. Are you prepared for that scrutiny? For what they might find? The threat. Because it was definitely a threat, hung in the air like smoke. I have nothing to hide," Thomas said coldly. "And if reopening the investigation helps us understand what happened to my daughter, then I welcome it. Maybe we'll finally get answers about who took her." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Perhaps? Or perhaps you'll discover that some answers are better left buried." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "I hope for your sake, Thomas, that you're right about her. Because if you're wrong, if this is a con, it will destroy what's left of this family. And if you're right," she looked back at Grace, something dark flickering in her eyes, "well, that might be even worse." She left, the door closing behind her with finality. The remaining guests tried to salvage the evening, but Eleanor's words had poisoned the celebration. They left early, offering congratulations that felt more like condolences. "Don't let her get to you," Thomas said after everyone had gone. They sat in the living room, the remains of the untouched celebration dinner growing cold in the kitchen. Eleanor has always been difficult, but she'll come around once she accepts this is real. But Grace kept thinking about Eleanor's words. That strange slip. Questions that might implicate who? What did Eleanor know about that day that she wasn't saying? "Dad," Grace said slowly. "What if Eleanor knows something about what happened to me?" Thomas looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" She got weird when she mentioned questions coming up, like she was worried about something specific being discovered. Grace leaned forward. "What if she knows who took me?" "Eleanor," Thomas shook his head. "No. She loved Margaret. She loved you. She would never, maybe not directly, but what if she knows something, saw something? What if she's been protecting someone all these years?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "You think I should ask her? I think we need to find out what she's hiding, outside." Night had fallen completely, but inside, in the warmth and light of the Calder mansion, Valentina Grace was finally, truly home. Even if that home held darker secrets than either of them had imagined, Grace couldn't sleep that night. Eleanor's words kept circling in her mind like vultures. That strange panic when she'd almost said too much. The way her eyes had gone dark when she looked at Grace, like she was seeing a problem that needed solving. At 3 a.m, Grace gave up on sleep entirely. She wrapped herself in a robe and padded through the quiet mansion, her feet silent on expensive carpet. She wasn't sure where she was going until she found herself outside Thomas's office. The door was unlocked. Inside, moonlight streamed through the windows, illuminating shelves lined with books and business awards. But Grace wasn't interested in those. She was looking for something else, She found the filing cabinet tucked in the corner, 3 drawers of what looked like personal documents. The top drawer was locked, but the second opened easily. Inside were folders organized by year, each one meticulously labeled in Thomas's precise handwriting. Grace pulled out the folder marked 2006, Valentina. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were police reports, private investigator summaries, newspaper clippings, all the documentation of her disappearance. Grace read through them slowly, seeing her own story from the outside for the first time. Margaret Calder states she looked away for approximately 2 to 3 minutes. No witnesses observed the child leaving the park. Extensive search of the surrounding area yielded no evidence. It was clinical and heartbreaking all at once. But what caught Grace's attention was a handwritten note clipped to one of the investigators' reports. The handwriting was different from Thomas's. Rounder, more feminine. Thomas. I spoke with the lead detective today. He's not optimistic about finding her alive at this point. I know this isn't what you want to hear, but we need to start preparing ourselves for the worst. For Margaret's sake, we should consider a memorial service. It might help her find closure. Eleanor? Grace flipped through more pages, finding other notes in that same rounded handwriting. Eleanor had been deeply involved in the search, it seemed, coordinating with investigators, speaking to police, organizing volunteer efforts. But there was something off about the notes, something that made Grace's skin prickle. I've asked the investigators to focus on the park and immediate area. No need to waste resources on broader searches. The detective wanted to look into family connections. I told him that was unnecessary. We know everyone close to Valentina. Thomas, you're exhausting yourself with these wild leads. Let me handle communications with the investigators. You need to focus on Margaret. Each note seemed helpful on the surface, but underneath, Grace could see a pattern. Eleanor systematically narrowing the search, controlling information, discouraging certain avenues of investigation. Why would she do that? Unless... What are you doing? Grace jumped, spinning around to find Thomas in the doorway. He was wearing pajamas and a robe, his hair mussed from sleep. I'm sorry, Grace said quickly. I couldn't sleep and I needed to understand what happened. I shouldn't have gone through your files without asking. Thomas crossed to her, looking at the papers spread across his desk. His expression went distant. I haven't looked at these in years. After a while, it was too painful. Dad, look at these notes. Grace showed him Eleanor's handwriting. She was involved in the investigation, right? Of course, she was devastated when you disappeared. Spent months helping organize searches. Talking to police, she was... Thomas trailed off, really reading the notes for the first time. She was always very focused on specific areas. Specifically focused on limiting the search, Grace said. Look, here she's telling investigators not to look at family connections. Here she's discouraging broader searches. It's like she was trying to control what they found. Thomas sank into his desk chair, studying the notes with new eyes. I never thought about it that way. At the time, I was grateful she was taking charge. Margaret was falling apart, and I was barely holding it together. Eleanor seemed like the only one thinking clearly, or the only one making sure they didn't look in the right places. Grace pulled out another folder. This one marked Financial, 2006. Can we look at this? Thomas nodded, and together, they went through his financial records from that year. Most of it was business transactions, investments, standard wealthy person money movement. But then Grace found something odd. A series of withdrawals in the weeks following her disappearance. Cash withdrawals, $50,000 total, spread across several transactions. Do you remember taking this money out? Grace asked. Thomas frowned. No, I might have. Everything from that time is a blur. Why? It's just unusual. You have records of every other transaction, what it was for, who it went to, but these cash withdrawals have no notation. Could have been for private investigators, Thomas said. I hired several who wanted payment off the books. Maybe, but Grace's instincts said otherwise. She kept digging, pulling out more folders, until she found one labeled Estate Management, 2006. Inside were property records, household expenses, and staff payment records. Grace flipped through them until she found what she was looking for, a list of people who had access to the Calder estate and accounts that year. Thomas Calder, Margaret Calder, and Eleanor Price, listed as family financial advisor. Eleanor had access to Thomas's accounts. She could have made those withdrawals herself. "Dad," Grace said slowly, "Eleanor had access to your money. She could have taken this cash without you knowing." Thomas's face went pale. "You think Eleanor took $50,000? "I think Eleanor might have used $50,000 to pay someone to take me." The words hung in the air between them, too terrible to be real but too logical to dismiss. Thomas shook his head. "No, Eleanor loved you. She loved Margaret. She would never—" "Did she love Margaret?" Grace interrupted. "Or did she resent her? You said Eleanor always thought Margaret wasted her potential marrying you. What if it was more than that? What if she hated that Margaret had what she didn't? A family. Money. Happiness. That's not— People don't kidnap children over jealousy. People do terrible things for all kinds of reasons." Grace thought about Eleanor's face at the dinner party, the way she'd looked at Grace like she was a problem to be eliminated. And now I'm back, and I'm a threat, not just to whatever secret she's keeping, but to her position in this family. Once I'm officially recognized as your heir, she loses her influence, Thomas finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. She's been the Calder family representative for years, making decisions, controlling narratives. With you back, she becomes irrelevant. They sat in silence. The evidence spread before them like accusations. It wasn't proof, not the kind that would hold up in court, but it was enough to paint a picture that made Grace's stomach turn. "We need more," Thomas said finally. "Before we accuse her of something like this, we need solid proof. The cash withdrawals aren't enough. I could have authorized them and forgotten. We need to connect her directly to what happened." "The orphanage," Grace said suddenly. "Someone dropped me there and paid them to take care of me. There must be records, descriptions of who it was, maybe even security footage if we're lucky." Thomas was already reaching for his phone. "The orphanage in Fresno, right? I'll have my investigators look into it first thing in the morning." "No," Grace put her hand over his. "Not your investigators. Eleanor might have connections to them. She helped hire them 19 years ago, didn't she? We need to do this ourselves." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay. Tomorrow, we drive to Fresno. Just you and me. We talk to whoever's still there from 2006 and see what they remember. And Eleanor, we don't tell her anything. Let her think we've accepted her doubts and moved on. If she knows we're investigating her, she might destroy evidence. Or worse." Grace thought about Eleanor's cold eyes, her carefully controlled rage. "You think she'd hurt us?" "I think someone who could kidnap a 5-year-old child is capable of anything." Thomas pulled Grace into a hug. "But I also think we're going to find out the truth. And when we do, Eleanor Price is going to pay for every year you lost." They stayed up the rest of the night, going through files, making notes, building their case. By the time the sun rose, they had a plan. And somewhere across town, Eleanor Price slept peacefully, not knowing that the daughter she'd tried to erase had come back with a memory and a mission. The truth was coming for her, and it wouldn't be gentle. They left for Fresno at dawn, Thomas behind the wheel of an unmarked sedan instead of his usual Mercedes. "No sense advertising who we are," he'd said. Grace agreed. This trip needed to stay off Eleanor's radar. The drive took 3 hours, giving them plenty of time to rehearse their story. They'd pose as family members doing genealogy research, looking into Grace's time at the orphanage. Nothing threatening. Nothing that would make anyone defensive. Saint. Catherine's home for children sat on the outskirts of Fresno, a tired-looking building that had probably been hopeful once, but now just looked worn down by decades of housing other people's unwanted kids. Grace felt a pang looking at it. She'd lived here, slept in one of those rooms, ate in that cafeteria, played in that small yard. She didn't remember any of it. "You okay?" Thomas asked, watching her face. "Yeah, just weird, you know. This place was my home for 5 years, and it's like looking at a stranger's house." They walked to the front entrance together, and Thomas squeezed her hand. "We've got this." The woman at the front desk was young, too young to have been here in 2006, but she was friendly enough when Thomas explained they were looking for information about Grace's time at the orphanage. "I'd love to help, but our records from that far back are pretty limited," she said apologetically. Budget cuts, you know. We don't keep as much as we probably should. Is there anyone still working here who might have been around in 2006? Grace asked. Someone who might remember? The receptionist thought for a moment. Sister Mary Catherine. She's been here forever. Like, literally since the 70s. She's semi-retired now, but she comes in on Thursdays to help with... She glanced at the calendar. Oh, hey, today's Thursday. She should be in the chapel if you want to talk to her. The chapel was small and quiet. Smelling of old wood and candle wax, Sister Mary Catherine knelt in the front pew, her gray habit worn soft with age. She looked up when they entered, and Grace saw immediately that this was a woman who'd seen everything life could throw at children, and had somehow maintained kindness despite it all. Can I help you? Her voice was gentle, Irish accent still thick after what must have been decades in America. Sister, my name is Grace Murphy. Well, it used to be. I think I stayed here when I was 5 years old. Back in 2006. I was hoping you might remember something about how I arrived. Sister Mary Catherine's eyes sharpened with interest. 2006. That's a long time ago, dear. What makes you think I'd remember you specifically? Because someone brought her here, Thomas said. Someone who paid for her care up front and then disappeared. I'm Thomas Calder. Grace is my daughter. She was kidnapped 19 years ago. And we're trying to figure out who took her. The nun's hand went to the cross around her neck. Lord have mercy, kidnapped. But the woman who brought her said, You do remember. Grace breathed. Sister, this is important. What did she say? What did she look like? Sister Mary Catherine gestured for them to sit. When they did, she closed her eyes, reaching back through years of children and crises to find this one memory. It was late spring, I think, April or May. A woman came with a little girl. You, I suppose. The child was quiet, withdrawn. The woman said she was a distant relative, that there'd been family trouble, and the girl needed somewhere safe to stay temporarily. She paid cash, quite a lot of it, enough to cover a year's care at least. What did she look like? Thomas leaned forward. The woman, can you describe her? Elegant? That's the word that comes to mind. Older than the typical parent we deal with. Maybe late 40s, early 50s, well-dressed, expensive clothes. She had this way of talking that made it clear she was used to people doing what she said. Grace felt her heart pounding. Did she give a name? If she did, I don't remember it, and I doubt it was real anyway. Sister Mary Catherine opened her eyes. I had my suspicions even then. Something about the situation felt wrong. The little girl was clearly traumatized. Wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat. But the woman insisted everything was fine, that the child just needed time and stability. Why didn't you call the police? Thomas's voice was strained. I wanted to, but the woman, she made it very clear that involving authorities would be bad for everyone, especially the child, and she'd paid enough money that my superiors were reluctant to question too closely. We needed the funding. The nun's face crumpled with old guilt. I'm sorry. I should have pushed harder. But I told myself at least the child was safe here. Warm and fed. That was better than wherever she'd been. Grace reached out and took the nun's wrinkled hand. You didn't do anything wrong. You helped me. You kept me safe. Do you have any records from that time? Thomas asked. Anything at all that might help us identify this woman? Sister Mary Catherine shook her head. Our records from that period are sparse, but... She paused, something occurring to her. We did have security cameras back then, just at the entrance. They were old, barely worked half the time, but they were there. The recordings were kept on tapes in the director's office. Are they still there? Grace asked urgently. I don't know. Father Murphy was director then. He passed 5 years ago. The new director might have kept them, might have thrown them out. We're not required to keep surveillance footage for more than a year. She stood. But we can ask. Come with me. The current director's office was cramped and cluttered. Boxes of old files stacked in corners. Director James Riley was a harried-looking man in his 40s who seemed overwhelmed by the question. Security tapes from 2006. Jesus, I don't know. Father Murphy wasn't exactly organized. There's still boxes of his stuff in the storage closet we haven't gone through. Can we look? Thomas asked. Please, it's important. Riley shrugged. Sure, why not? Doors unlocked. Good luck finding anything in there, though. The storage closet was worse than Grace expected. A jumble of old records, broken equipment, and miscellaneous junk accumulated over decades. But she and Thomas dove in, pulling out boxes, checking labels when there were any, opening containers to see what was inside. 40 minutes later, Grace found them. "Dad, look!" She held up a cardboard box labeled Security 2005-2007 in faded marker. Inside were dozens of VHS tapes, each one marked with a date range. Thomas pulled them out one by one, checking dates. April 2006, May 15th, 2006. Sister Mary Catherine peered at the date. That would be right around when she arrived. They borrowed Riley's ancient VCR and television. Setting it up in an empty office, Thomas slid the tape in, and they watched grainy black and white footage of the orphanage entrance from 19 years ago. Days flicked by and fast forward, children coming and going, staff arriving for shifts. Nothing remarkable then. On May 19th at 3:47 p.m., a car pulled up. Grace hit pause,